Today we're going to be talking about The Perks of Being a Wallflower, a wonderful novel by Stephen Chbosky that's kind of coming of age story from America. It's actually part 2. I did another video on the first section of the book that you can find linked over my shoulder here. We're going to do a kind of deeper analysis, go into some close readings of a few quotes, and then really talk about some of the themes and symbols and the language that Chbosky uses, and how his main character, the narrator Charlie, deals with some of his familiar relationships and a lot of stuff about gender dynamics, siblings, brothers, sisters, fathers, violence, men, women, abuse, trauma, how that comes out in his character and reflects on Charlie's identity. Charlie starts off this chapter or section with an odd kind of quote about Zen. He tells us he doesn't know about things that are Chinese or Indians and what they do as part of their religion. And this comes really out of context for the 1990s America and the culture and subculture that Charlie's a part of. But what's happening here is the author is kind of signaling to us about an experience that Charlie's going to have later. And he's going to start tying in his identity to this idea of otherness and reaching out to the affinity or the infinite and the ethereal. So the non-body experience, corporeal, almost like something spiritual. Hence this tie into Eastern mysticism. So we start out with a more direct quote where he talks about a game the kids used to play in the schoolyard. His brother especially, his violent football player, masculine brother, was really good at this game. The game is called Smear the Queer. It's an obvious insult, homophobic, really inappropriate and nasty language. But the kids don't know that, of course. They're naive, they're innocent to what they're playing at. So it's this larger culture of hate and homophobia and violence that's seeping in to their own nostalgic memories. Charlie tells us, "One thing I remember is that the kids used to play a game. What you do is take a football or something, and one person would have it, and all the other kids would try to tackle that kid." Violence, right? You're trying to catch and tackle someone. And then whoever gets the ball next would run around with it, and the kids would try to tackle him. It's passing off, right? He's hinting again at the vicious circle, which we talked about a bit in the last video. And this could go on for hours. I never really understood the point of it, but my brother loved it. He didn't like to run with the ball so much as he liked to tackle people. Again, the brother being the aggressor, the symbol of violence. The kids called the game, quote, Smear the Queer. I didn't really think about what that means until now. So Charlie's essentially telling us he's becoming a more reflective or critical thinker. He's starting to think about how the words and the language and the ideas used in his culture influence him. How they're more than just names. How these words affect how we think and how we frame things that are around us. And so Charlie's process of getting older and becoming an adult is also one of creating his own identity, distinct from the culture he's been raised in, distinct from his brother and his sister, who both tend towards being like their parents. Charlie wants to be something else. He needs to stop being a wallflower and start being an individual. The next quote really digs into some of the gendered roles and stereotypes and cliche around the identity of being a woman or being a young girl, an adolescent girl, a teenage girl, a college student in America, and specifically the roles they're expected to play and how they're often expected to denigrate each other or to treat each other poorly. And this is tied in, and Charlie's just realizing this, with the idea of the male gaze, or how a man or the culture itself or a big I, like that lens, is constantly looking and assessing at a woman or a girl and judging her based on her outward appearance, the corporeal, right, not the spiritual. Quote, "I think it's bad when a boy looks at a girl and thinks that the way he sees the girl is better than the way she actually is." So Charlie thinks there's something deeper, right? He thinks that there's some soul or person or identity inside that can be found, and it's not necessarily skin deep, right? It's not just in the superficial appearance. And I think it's bad when the most honest way a boy can look at a girl is through a camera. It's very hard for me to see Sam feel better about herself just because an older boy sees her that way. So now we're getting into her boyfriend. Sam is, of course, Charlie's crush. Craig is her older boyfriend. He's a photographer, maybe an artist, but also he's sort of reflective of this idea of the camera, or the male gaze, and also the adult male starting to sexualize or commodify women's bodies. And Charlie doesn't know how he feels about that, or if he wants to participate in that culture. I asked my sister about this, and she said that Sam has low self-esteem. My sister also said that Sam had a reputation when she was a sophomore. According to my sister, Sam used to be, quote, a blow queen. So now we're really getting into this quote here. What's happening is that the sister is attacking Sam's character. And why she feels the need to do this, we're not sure. Maybe she also has a self-esteem issue. Maybe it's a part of a larger cultural impetus to put down women and generally to be misogynistic. But notice too that the insult to be a blow queen, it's a sexualized thing, right? It's about being loose or liberal or open with her body and her choices, and about taking that from her or using it to shame her and victim shame her for being herself. It's also this classic idea of identity attack, right? You attack someone's status, you attack their personhood, and it's another way of being violent without actually physically inflicting pain upon that person, because you can tear down their culture, you can tear down their personhood and character. I hope you know what that means, because I can't really think about Sam and describe it to you. I'm really in love with Sam, and it hurts very much. So now we're seeing too how Charlie's taking a risk here. The guy who's been separate, who's been off to himself, away from his family, not bonded yet, is finding himself more deeply connected with Sam, and by doing that, he's allowing himself to be vulnerable. And this, in turn, of course, can hurt, right? He's exposed himself. And now we get this sort of flip side, right? We go from this quote about teenage girls spreading rumors, attacking each other, name-calling, whispering rumors behind backs, etc., the low blows that inflate and deflate each other's self-esteem, to Charlie talking about his brother, the heroic football player, the apotheosized god, the man on campus walking around, the inflictor of punishment and pain on the football field, but maybe a gentle lover off the field? We'll see. Quote, personally, I like to think my brother is having a college experience like they do in the movies. So already we see that there's this media influence. Charlie's getting his idea of what's normal from outside. It's being pushed on him, this idea of the collective identity of the good boyfriend, the football player, the letterman, the athlete. I don't mean the big fraternity party kind of movie. More like the movie where the guy meets a smart girl who wears a lot of sweaters and drinks cocoa. It makes me think of like Sleepless in Seattle or When Harry Met Sally, right? Kind of 90s rom-com, maybe Reality Bites or High Fidelity. They talk about books and issues and Kiss in the Rain. Can you picture John Cusack and Tom Hanks? I can. I think something like that would be very good for him, especially if the girl were unconventionally beautiful. They're the best kind of girls, I think. I personally find, quote, supermodels strange. I don't know why that is. My brother, on the other hand, has posters of supermodels and cars and beers and things like that on the wall. What are things like that? Cars, beer, supermodels. They're products, they're commodities, they're things that the American commercial culture is selling at large. And a lot of the gendered talk and nature of character in this book, and certainly in this chapter, is about how these unique individuals start to lose their own personal identity and their sense of self when they get to high school, hit puberty, and are forced through adolescence to become a part of this greater cultural exchange in America. And the pressure, right? The pressure for Charlie to become masculine or strong, the pressure on Sam and the sister to be a good girl, to behave, to be womanly, to look a certain way. We also have this nice little moment right before Christmas when the family gathers together where they watch the football game. And the football game here is really symbolic and signifies a kind of spiritual moment for American popular culture. Just like Charlie's reaching out to these ideas from the East that are Chinese or Indian, looking for some other answer to life's mysteries, the American cultural identity of violence and commercial and cars and beers and supermodels is looking to the football field for answers. It wants physical, exemplary shows of dominance, of gladiatorial, warrior-like culture. And Charlie tells us, but in that moment, when my brother took the field, all that washed away and everyone was proud. So the strife, it's unified through this collective identity. Penn State football, Nittany Lions, Americans. At one point, my brother made a very big play on third down and everyone cheered, even though some of us had already seen the game before. So this is a through line. Sport, sports teams, culture, the logos literally connects them all. A little later in the chapter, there's a quote when Charlie starts to talk about his present for Patrick. So he's forming a real bond with Patrick. And this is his first real bond, possibly since his friend Michael, who committed suicide, he's forming with another male. So he's having an actual male friend, right? He doesn't relate that way to his brother or his father. And his relationship with the English teacher, Bill, is different. That's a mentor-mentee relationship. It's not a friendship on equal terms. But he's connecting with Patrick. And one of the ways he's going to do this is by making him a mixtape. And these bands, these sort of rebellious, independent, grunge rock, alt rock, classic rock bands that Charlie's finding and identifying, they're kind of rebellion, right? They're already a part of this otherness, outsider culture. And that's what Charlie is starting to drift towards. It's what the Rocky Horror Picture Show is. It's what making zines is all about. It's what rock and roll is really about, or at least was. He tells us, the first present is going to be a mixtape. I just know that it should. I already have the songs picked out and a theme. It's called One Winter. But I've decided not to hand color the cover. Lots of songs by the Village People and Blondie because Patrick likes that type of music. It also has Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana. Note Nirvana, a connection, allusion to Eastern religion through the name of the famous grunge rock band, which Sam and Patrick love, but the second side is the one I like the most. And then he lists all these songs. So I actually put together a playlist of all the songs in this mixtape on YouTube. I will link that over this shoulder, I believe, for you if you'd like to check it out. So he runs down through the list, but they're all basically rebellious songs. Songs of social leadership, references to Martin Luther King, to Scarborough Fair and Gypsy and Dusk, like Landslide by Fleetwood Mac. All of this stuff is about a kind of outsider culture that defies the American norms and the cultural values that Charlie is struggling to adapt to in high school. He also tells us that these songs really mean a lot to him as a writer. So I think it would be great to have written one of these songs. I bet if I wrote one of them, I would be very proud. I hope the people who wrote these songs are happy. I hope that they feel it's enough. I really do, because they've made me happy, and I am only one person. Charlie is now literally explicitly telling us his individual identity is tied up to these songwriters and their lyrics and the sort of social movements and the activism that they've tied into, the outsider rebellion culture that these bands and rock and roll are connecting Charlie to through words, are also then influencing his own idea of himself as a creator, a writer, and an artist. So there's another big section here and a sort of large incident, a bit of a plot point, turning point in the book, where the brother and sister face off in the backseat of the car when they're on their way to their relatives for Christmas. And they have this yelling match. And similar to the way the chapter started with this idea of the East versus the West and the collective identity versus the individual identity of different religions or cultures, the brother and the sister here sort of represent the two sides of an argument, the pro, the con, the yin, the yang, maybe the left and the right. I think it's more along the idea of the norm and the deviant, right? The straight and narrow versus the finding your own path. For the first half hour, even though I had to sit on the hump in the back seat, Notice Charlie is classically stuck in the middle. Because my dad kept asking questions about college and my brother kept talking, he's dating one of those cheerleader girls who does flips during football games. Her name is Kelly. Kelly, Saved by the Bell. My dad was very interested in that. My sister made some remark about how cheerleading is stupid and sexist. And my brother told her, shut up. Kelly was majoring in philosophy. I asked my brother if Kelly was unconventionally beautiful. No, she's hot beautiful. So you see there's this tug, right? This pull of the sister versus the brother, and Charlie in between, trying to still connect with the brother, trying to connect with the sister earlier, but not understanding her when her boyfriend hit her. He doesn't understand either of these things. There's also a lot in this chapter, which can really be a whole other, video about the ties between The Catcher in the Rye and Charlie reading The Catcher in the Rye and identifying it as a coming-of-age story about an outsider character. But I can't dig into all that right here. Suffice to say that it turns into a war of words that's really about a man putting down a woman. Set aside the brother and sister. This is about the culture of men and misogyny in America, using words and sexism and misogyny to humiliate and ultimately say things that are homophobic and hateful to denigrate women. My sister started talking about how the way a woman looks is not the most important thing. I agreed, but then my brother started saying about how my sister was, quote, just a bitchy dyke. Okay, so two things here. Let's really break it down, word for word. First word, comparison to a woman as an animal, i.e. less than human, trying to take away her status as a representative human being, trying to lower her from the status where the brother and the man is to some inferior status, i.e. like man or Adam had control over animals from God. Secondly, a homophobic slur generally used towards lesbians. Why specifically that word? Well, lesbian is someone and a whole culture of someone who don't necessarily need men around or have to participate with the masculine forms and violence and ideas that this brother character represents. So what is he insulting her with? The thing he is most afraid of, right? His culture of extreme masculinity and violence and warrior gladiatorial football playing is completely irrelevant and unnecessary to the culture of Lesbos and poetry and women without men. Quote, another Greek reference, by the way, here. My sister spent the next 10 minutes denouncing the Greek system of sororities and fraternities. She kept telling me stories of hazing and how kids have died before. She then told this one story about how she heard there's a sorority that made the new girls stand in their underwear while they circled their, quote, fat in red magic markers. My brother had enough of my sister at this point. He yelled, bullshit. Get what's happening here, right? The sister is offering evidence, a story, an anecdote of these things that the brother is trying to put on a pedestal. And she's saying, actually, they humiliate people, shame people, and can even cause suicide. If you're thinking about suicide, you're upset, get help. Call someone, find a helpline, find a center. I'll post a link to both the video. It does get better. Life gets better. Live it one day at a time. Anyhow, the brother basically here is representing hateful, fear-mongering masculinity. And the sister here is representing the alternative. We also, to add on this idea of violent masculine hatred that is really brewing and building and adding up around Charlie, get this story about his great aunt who was in a relationship with a man that beat her and her mother, and eventually the solution, quote unquote, solution to this problem was that he was beat to death by the great uncle, their brother. So again, it's going back to this idea of a vicious circle, right? Violence begets violence, like the Code of Hammurabi, as far back as human law, an eye for an eye, violence upon violence. It is not the solution. And this again hints at this idea of Chinese or Indian religion and mysticism, and Charlie looking for some other way of being to become a whole person. And one of the reasons why he needs to become a whole person is that he's still grieving for his aunt because he feels responsible somewhat for her death. He tells us, "The first time I drove alone was to see my Aunt Helen at the grave. It was the first time I ever went to see her without at least my mom. I made it a special time. I bought flowers with my Christmas money. I even made her a mixtape and left it at the grave. I hope that you do not think that makes me weird. I told my Aunt Helen all about my life." He's now reaching a sort of low point. So at the end of the second act, as often happens, we get this climax and then a bomb off a cliff. And that's what happens to Charlie here. He bombs from the high point of Sam having kissed him, which was up till then really the most excitement he's literally physically had in this book and maybe his life, to this drastic low point soon after. "I just remember what made me think of all this. I'm gonna write it down because maybe if I do, I won't have to think about it." So another hint here, the reason Charlie writes letters is to try and expunge this stuff, to try and get it off his back, get the proverbial monkey off his back and let some of the steam out of his system. And I won't get upset, but the thing is that I can hear Sam and Craig having sex. And for the first time in my life, I understand the end of that poem. That poem, which is a reference to suicide. I reiterate, if you need help, link below. And I never wanted to. You have to believe me. Love always, Charlie. Thanks for watching the video. I'm Mr. Jordan. Like, sub, all that other stuff. If you love book talk and analysis of novels and literature like I do, join me. It should be fun. Take care until next time.